Good morning, everyone. I'm Natalia Kapitnik, Director of Communications at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's discussion. We are very excited to launch this special series of our Chain Reaction podcast. Over the next few months, the Continent series will explore how the war in Ukraine is changing Europe's politics and security. Just a reminder that this discussion is being recorded and will be available on our website, www.fpri.org, as well as on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and also here on Twitter. So with that, we'll get started, and I'll turn it over to Aaron.
All right. Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. Welcome to the Continent. I'm Aaron. I'm a fellow with FPRI's Eurasia program. And over the years, I have focused on Russia's politics, economy, security, and the intersection of the three. This podcast, however, is not about Russia. Just before Putin launched his invasion of Ukraine, I was talking with my friend and colleague Chris Miller, who happens to head FPRI's Eurasia program, and we agreed that beyond the rather obvious implications of a war for both Russia and Ukraine, such a war might also have a tremendous impact in Europe, its politics, security considerations, maybe even how it sees its place in the world. So that's what the Continent will be focusing on. In the coming weeks, I'll be visiting, that's in quotations, a variety of countries and speaking to regional specialists, learning about how Ukraine is impacting their countries of focus. I want to emphasize the learning here. Civilization is next to Western Europe, not in it. So I'm going to be asking questions, hopefully learning a bunch. I hope you'll stick around and learn with me. A quick technical note, we'll be doing this podcast, as Natalia mentioned, as a mix of Twitter Spaces and traditional recordings. Both will be uploaded to FPRI's Chain Reaction podcast, available just about everywhere you can find podcasts. Now, before we dive into today's episode, I just want to thank FPRI for their continued support of this project. So let's zoom in and focus on the critical subject of the day, Germany. At least from my vantage points, Germany has seen some of the most radical changes in its politics in recent months, which is why we're starting there. Today's title is a play on words, and as all puns go, they're always better when you have to explain in detail. So let me explain. It's a play on the word Bundes-where in German, which is the name of Germany's armed forces. But I'm asking Bundes-where. Where does Germany and its military stand in light of everything that's what is the latest on the kind of political conjuncture in Germany? Hysterical, right? But no, I'm really excited to host our guests today. Joining us are Doctors Jana, Puglierin, and Marcel Dirsus. Let's start by having them introduce themselves, and because we can't see each other, I will call them. Jana, if you could start, if you could share your affiliation and research interests.
Thanks, Aaron, for having me. My name is Jana Puglierin. I'm a senior policy fellow with the European Council on Foreign Relations, and I'm heading ECFR's Berlin office. My research interests include European and German foreign security and defense policy more broadly, but also specifically I'm interested in NATO and the transatlantic relationship. Yeah, I've worked on all things related to the EU previously. I have been working in the Bundestag. I have been working at Bonn University. So my background is in academia, in parliament, but now I'm a think tanker CFR since January 2020. And before that, I have been heading the Europe program of the German Council on Foreign Relations. And I'm very happy to be here and to talk all things related to our latest Zeitenwende, turning point in history that we just declared, or that our Chancellor just declared, and looking forward to the conversation.
Great to have you. Marcel, over to you.
Hey, thanks for having me. My name is Marcel. I'm a political scientist, and I'm a non-resident fellow at the Institute for Security Policy at the University of Kiel. Like I said, my background is in academia. To begin with, I didn't really look at German foreign policy, and I wrote my PhD about military coups, which is a little bit different. But over the years, I've gotten more involved in foreign policy, and I guess it's quite difficult to escape that, if you are German and you're interested in policy more generally. I'm happy to be here, happy to talk about this topic. I think it's really important, and I think this is an interesting format.
Great to have both of you. So I want to turn to our first topic here, and Jana said the word. So one of the words I've learned recently, and I'm a huge language nerd, so this was exciting, is Zeitenwende. It's this idea of a shift in eras, a kind of paradigm shift. Fun fact for other fellow language nerds, Zeitenwende, like Wende is the same root as like a winding road in German. So there's your fun fact of the day. But I wanted to ask, and I was talking to Marcel a little bit about this, or at least messaging back and forth, how big a deal is this shift in German politics and public opinion? Does this have a parallel. What are we seeing as far as the shift? Can we talk through kind of the narrative, what has changed, what you're seeing? And we'll start with Marcel here.
From my point of view, it's a massive shift. I'm definitely not old enough to have seen a bigger shift yet in German politics, so there might have been one, but not one that I can remember. I think what we're looking at really is almost a 180 in many aspects of German foreign policy in the span of just a couple of weeks. So even though from abroad it might look too slow, and people are accusing Berlin of dithering, which in many ways it is, from within Germany, it's happening at great speed, and I think that creates a huge mismatch also between perceptions from within Germany and outside of it.
Jana, any thoughts on the matter?
I'm not sure how big our Zeitenwende is going to be. I agree with Marcel that some kind of revolutionary decisions have been made in a rather short amount of time. But then again, so far, it's just one speech and some decisions, right? It's not what I think is needed, kind of a long-term shift of German security and defense policy, of our approach towards Russia, of our approach towards dealing with autocracies, of revising this idea of kind of change through trade, Wandel durch Handel. I think we see a promising beginning, but already kind of some worrying signals that the trend might be stalling. And I certainly can remember, I'm than Marcel, I guess, but I can remember the debates we had during the Kosovo War, when it was about a red-green coalition government kind of joining a war. That was a big thing. That was really highly contested, and that was for the Green Party, I think, an epochal change as well. Now we see another one, and certainly, I mean, the war is different, and I think this one is, I don't know, maybe we shouldn't compare wars, but of course, this is the first kind of full-scale war where kind of battle tanks roll over borders, kind of, and having a nuclear power engaged. But so I think we have been at a point where we have been debating fundamental shifts in German security and defense policy already after Kosovo, where many of the things that we are debating now, we already debated, and then we stopped debating them. And that's why I'm maybe more cautious. And I hope that we are really seeing a reversal of many things that we have, I think, done wrong. But I'm also a bit skeptical how big the shift will be in the very end.
No, I was going to say, yeah, I mean, that's totally fair, right? And it also depends on whether you're looking at rhetoric or whether you're actually looking at, concrete policy changes, right? Obviously, the speech that Scholz gave on the Zeitenwende was, I thought, very strong. I thought, oh my God, this could actually go well for a change. It was like a whole 10 minutes of, optimism. And then obviously the follow-up was much weaker. So yeah, I don't want to hype it too much. And to be honest with you, it sort of depends on the day for me. Sometimes I think, oh my God, so much has improved. We've come such a long way. And then, if you ask me on another day, I'm like, my God, this is so slow. You can already see the setbacks. We should be doing so much more. So I guess it really depends on how you look at it, right? Like, do you want to grade Germany on a curve? And compare Germany's current rhetoric and current policy to the way that German policy and rhetoric used to be. If that's the case, then we're looking at a pretty big shift. Or do you compare it to something that could be seen as a sensible foreign policy? And if that's the case, then we're still quite far removed from it, I'd argue.
I think it's just a good start. So Zeitenwende, the speech and everything that was declared so far is a good start, but I think it now needs to be filled with life. It needs to be continued, and we cannot afford to lose steam.
So I want to go over just some of for the audience here, some of the kind of narrative, like what actually happened in the speech. But another question first that I wanted to ask, just because of my vantage point here in DC, there's lots of conversation. I'll go to happy hours after work and hear conversation about the latest news in Ukraine. And that is, I would say, not indicative of how regular people are thinking about this, if they're thinking about it at all. So wanted to ask folks who, you're in Germany, is the war in Ukraine, what kind of traction is this getting in German society? Is this something that people would talk about with their cab driver, or Germany's defender, if not the specifics of the policy? Hey, we need to think about this. Is that getting traction in society in your view?
Maybe I can start briefly. I think what is really new for Germans, for the society more broadly, is that for the first time, actually lifetime, in my adult lifetime, is that people feel threatened. That started immediately after the war in Germany. unlike in the United States, not many people have seen the war coming. Our government has been telling people that this is not very likely. And so I think it was actually a tremendous shock when the war started. And so, because from a German perspective, I think many people here were really convinced that we have left all this behind, kind of that territorial confrontation of that size is a thing of the past and would happen in all kinds of places, but certainly not in Europe and certainly not 2 flight hours away from Berlin. So people felt threatened for the first time, and it was a dramatic shift in public opinion, whereas there was not a lot of interest in all things foreign policy related, which you saw perfectly during the last general election campaign, where this was just a non-issue. Foreign policy, security, defense, people barely talked about it and weren't interested. Now, my friends who are not very much interested generally in international politics are very worried, concerned, and they talk about it. That has advantages and disadvantages, because also, actually a lot of people lately are very afraid of I don't know, a further escalation of the war. And people are aware all of a sudden that there are Russian nuclear weapons stationed not that far away from Germany, and that an Iskander missile from Kaliningrad could hit Berlin in under 5 minutes. And that is new.
That puts it in pretty stark perspective. Marcel, any thoughts or comments from your end here?
Yeah, I've had a similar experience to Jana, I think. People were reaching out to me, asking me whether we're going to get nuked, that sort of thing. It didn't really happen beforehand, which, I guess is good. But yeah, I would say that fear is key here. A lot of people are genuinely really, really worried. They are afraid, because like Jana said, they just haven't really thought about war. We've been really comfortable. Germans have been able to feel very safe for multiple decades. So I think this is just new to them. And you see that in, sort of play out in the debates that are being had in Germany, not just in politics, but also in journalism and in the talk shows and so forth, right? So you've got more people involved in the debate, and that leads to some, interesting debates. Perhaps that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
So wanted to follow up. So we talked about Scholz's Zeitenwende speech. Can we talk through what concretely he and what that kind of the details of the speech? Marcel, can I ask you about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a good way. How do I structure it? I guess essentially the big theme, I suppose, was that Germany is going to take security more seriously, and then there were multiple parts to this, I'd say. So one was that Germany is going to increase military spending quite drastically. So you've got sort of a long-term defense spending increase, perhaps, but then you've also got the famous billions that are going to come in a God, how do you say this in English, Jana? Do you know? Sondervermögen?
I always called it special fund for the Bundeswehr, but that doesn't nail it.
That's good. Okay, so aside from sort of long-term increases in defense spending, there's going to be a special fund for the Bundeswehr, to sort of get us to a respectable baseline, supposedly, where you have a functioning military again, essentially. So that was sort of like the main headline, and then there were also a couple of smaller things that have been debated in Germany for the longest time. So one of the examples was armed drones. I don't know whether you're aware of it, but Germany has had a debate about armed drones for multiple decades, I guess, at this point, well over 10 years at least. While all kinds of other countries have been getting armed drones, in Germany, people have been saying that that drones shouldn't be armed because it's evil. Sort of the weapon itself is evil, and that's why Germany shouldn't have it. So that sort of thing was also mentioned in Scholz's speech. So yeah, I guess the big line is, Germany is going to take its security more seriously, spend more on defense, acquire new weapon systems. I think that's sort of the headline, I'd say.
Can I?
Please, absolutely.
Because I think one thing is really important looking at what Scholz has said during the speech. The speech was written in the first days of the war, basically, 3 days after the war started. And all observers, at least here in Germany, still assumed a quick victory for Russia. So the speech was not primarily announcing kind of a long-term plan, detailed plan about the future of German foreign security and defense policy, but it was actually a quick reaction to a scenario of Russia possibly taking all of Ukraine. and then basically justifying the 100 billion for defense and kind of the need for Germany to move on defense and to do things that were prior to the start of the war unthinkable. What is also important is, I think, to understand that Olaf Scholz had no intention to do a revolution in Germany's security and defense policy. He campaigned as Angela Merkel in a suit. He was elected to be Angela Merkel in a suit. He had ambitious ideas for changing kind of Germany's domestic policy, but foreign policy was really supposed to be all about continuity. And then the war happened, and then there was this shock, and actually, the assumption that the Russians would win this quickly. And then, in a reaction to this, Scholz announced all the things that Marcel has just said, but also, in addition, that Germany needs to contribute to strengthening NATO's eastern flank significantly, and the kind of that Germany would now have the taboo to send arms to Ukraine, because prior to this war, I mean, there were exceptions when we sent weapons to the Peshmerga in 2014, but it was considered a taboo to send weapons into countries that were in a war, in an armed conflict. So it was about arms deliveries to Ukraine. It was about far-reaching sanctions against Russia. It was about strengthening NATO's eastern flank. It was about the Sondervermögen, the special fund, and about the 2%. And later, the 2% and the Sondervermögen merged. And it was, not to forget, about energy dependence on Russia to reduce it. So there were some announcements about LNG terminals and how to make Germany more energy independent from Russia.
So the special fund, I'm not going to try to pronounce the word in German. I just, for some math, because I was struck by this. I think working a lot in my day job with data, people struggle to understand like what big numbers actually mean. So it's 100 billion euro, and doing that, putting that in concrete terms, if Germany were to spend all of that on tanks, which is not going to, but if it were, it would be about 6,000 tanks. That is a lot. Now, of course, won't be all spent on that, but just for scale. I wanted to ask, since we're talking about Scholz and his positioning and his speech, I want to ask about how the kind of various political parties in Germany, in the coalition, outside of the coalition, have positioned themselves around this crisis. And there's something really interesting that I couldn't help but notice as an American that was very glaring to me. So our Green Party here has been accused literally of being a Russian cutout. Jill Stein visited Moscow before the 2016 election. It is viewed as, accurately or inaccurately, very soft on Russia. In the German context, and this is what seems crazy to me, the Green Party seems to be the most hawkish party towards Russia in the entire political arena. So can you talk about that and explain to me how that's possible? What's that?
Marcel, do you start?
Yeah. The Greens are, they're quite, I'm never really quite sure whether hawkish is the right word, because I suppose, in the American, context, hawkish basically means that, you sort of rarely find a war that you don't want to get involved in, right? So I would say that in the German context, hawkish is perhaps not quite accurate, but it is accurate to say that the Greens have probably had the toughest position, not just on Russia, perhaps, but perhaps also on China. I think in their case, it's not so much about, bringing democracy to far-flung places or, necessarily advancing the German national interest, but, they very much want a bigger role for human rights and values in foreign policy. And they've been critiquing the previous German policy very heavily. And that previous German policy, of course, was essentially a maximization of short-term economic interest. And they want to move beyond that. So, in that sense, they did want to take a tougher line on Russia, but not so much when it came to military power, because the Greens have traditionally been quite skeptical of the utility of force in international relations. Now, that doesn't mean that, they're pacifists or that necessarily they have been pacifists, because, they have agreed to some Bundes-where missions in the past, of course. But that is, I would say, different from the American context, where hawkish, at least I associate with military power, essentially.
What is super interesting about the Green Party is that basically they have warned for a long time against this idea to get so energy dependent on Russia. They have been opposing Nord Stream 2 forever, basically. And now, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, where Germany is viewed with quite some suspicion these days, the Greens actually have a much better reputation because they have been very critical with the Russian government. They have been looking at what happens to civil society in Russia, how it is crashed, basically, and how the country becomes basically a dictatorship. And the Greens were very aware of all of this, whereas in the CDU and especially in the SPD, people were very, very ready to close their eyes and to say that, no, we are not overly dependent on Russia. That's all manageable, and there isn't a problem. Russia is a reliable energy supplier. And so the Green Party got it right a long time ago.
So a question about that. Oh, please go, Marcel.
No, I was just going to say, one thing that I guess makes it easier for them is that they are less involved in creating this mess in the first place.
Yeah.
Right? So, it's always a little bit funny when the CDU goes after the Social Democrats for having messed up, and then the Social Democrats go after the CDU for having messed up, because they've all messed up. They all screwed up big time. And, like I said, the Greens haven't gotten everything right, particularly when it comes to, military force, perhaps, but they got it more right than the others. And because they didn't make the decisions that made Germany dependent on Russian energy, for example, it's now easier for them to take a harder line than it would be for Social Democrats, for example, because the same people that screwed up are still in power, basically.
So I guess two follow-up questions there that I'm curious about. One of the things I've read about this kind of change in German politics, or rather the difference between parties, is just the age of the leadership, where it seems to me, or was written, that Green Party leadership is younger, kind of from a fundamentally different generation. Do you view that as a reasonable argument or a credible explanation of the difference in policy between the parties?
I'm a bit doubtful, because there was recently an essay published by Jürgen Habermas, basically the intellectual pope in Germany, and he basically said that the generation of Annalena Baerbock, our foreign minister, is not is too young to understand what war really means, and is kind of approaching things not kind of from a rational point of view, but with too many emotions. So I'm a bit allergic against this generational stance, because there are actually many young politicians also, at least in the SPD, the new party head, or one of the two party heads, Lars Klingbeil. He's also, I think he's 44, so just 4 years older than Annalena Baerbock, or 3 years older. And Christian Lindner from the FDP is also about that age. So, so I wouldn't make it about age. I think for the Greens, it was, and also for the Liberals, I think they always emphasized also kind of democracy in the struggle, democracy versus autocracy. I think Marcel alluded to that previously. So that was always something that was more important for the smaller parties than for the big parties. But I don't really know if it's a generational thing. I don't know. Maybe I'm just allergic, because I think this characterization of generation Annalena Baerbock is kind of, those are the kind of the people, the young kind of emotional women. I found that completely misplaced.
Yeah, it's misplaced. That it's not a characterization that's fair by any stretch. Marcel, over to you.
Yeah, I agree. I don't really think it's a generational thing. Like I said, I think some of it is structural. Who's in power, who's not in power, what's their history. And of course, you have young and old people agreeing, with either position, right? When it comes to things like delivery of arms and so forth. So I'm not really sure that age is the determining factor here.
But what is interesting, just because I remember this when I was analyzing the German election result, is that the younger generation in Germany, so people under 40, were much more likely to vote for either the Greens or the smaller parties with kind of this clear value compass and kind of new ideas about modernizing Germany, also domestic. So maybe there is something to it when it comes to voters. Younger people were attracted by the smaller parties, but I think also because they stood for something different than the Grand Coalition, and I think people just wanted change in Germany. I mean, change that didn't hurt too much, but still, younger people wanted to see something different.
I think that's a good point. The question is, though, sort of what did they really vote for, right?
Yeah.
I was looking at the campaign posters of the Greens, for example, during the last election, which of course isn't that long ago. And when it came to arms deliveries, for example, they had a poster where they more or less said that Germany should just not export arms, or definitely not export arms into, war zones. And now, the Greens are pushing for that more strongly than any other party in German politics, right? So, yeah, I mean, it might be that a lot of young people have, voted for them, but, are they really getting sort of what they voted for now?
So the question, so we talked about the Greens. I also wanted to talk about something Jana alluded to earlier on. So we had the Social Democrats, Scholz, with this, big speech, which was a firm line on what needs to happen for Germany, even if reacting to what seems like a probable scenario at the time may not be the scenario now. How have the Social Democrats, has the rhetoric evolved? Jana, you said that there may be some backsliding or risk that this policy that was announced might not be implemented. What about the Christian Democrats? Where are they positioning themselves on this? So all of the above. Do you want to go first?
Actually, when Scholz gave this, I think, historic speech, this was met with broad consensus in the Bundestag among all the what we call mainstream parties, so not the very left and not the very right of the spectrum of political parties in Germany, but actually the Christian Democrats, they all applauded. They even, one of them even shouted "Bravo," and many were kind of really excited. So there was this moment when there was this broad consensus, and I had the impression it was some sort of all hands on deck approach. So people realized this is kind of really something special. This is an historic moment, and we really all need to make sure that we are getting this right. And what we see now is that we see first cracks emerging, and in the Social Democracy, because the truth is also that Olaf Scholz, when he gave the speech, he did not consult with his party or even his coalition partners closely before he gave the speech. So he made up his mind. He, I think, talked to a number of people, I think a handful of people, and then he gave the speech. And you saw that when you watched the debate in Parliament, that whereas the CDU, the Christian Democrats, were super happy with everything that Scholz said, some of the Greens weren't so happy. And you see now that the Green Party and the SPD, they have members who come from it, who have a different background, a pacifist background against, as Marcel just said, against more arms exports, not very much in favor of what they often call the militarization of German foreign policy. And so now you see that these people who have been pretty for some weeks because of the shock and the war are now starting to raise criticism much more openly and to question whether this whole approach doesn't go too far. So this is one problem that I think especially Olaf Scholz needs to manage, that within his own party, very influential people don't share his overall assessment, or at least they don't want to go any further. And I think on the part of the Christian Democrats, you saw that basically they realize now that a topic was stolen from them. They consider themselves to be the party of the Bundes-where. They advocate for the Bundes-where. They always talked about the need to spend 2%, and they always said, oh, we cannot do this because the Social Democrats are holding us back. And there is some truth to this. The Social Democrats prevented Germany from procuring armed drones 8 years ago. They delayed the decision to find a successor solution for the Tornado airplane that allows us to remain in the nuclear sharing arrangement in NATO. But it was also kind of the Christian Democrats that that were responsible for defense policy, having the minister for 16 years and the chancellor. So the CDU now sees that the SPD goes further than they ever dreamt. And they feel threatened because the SPD basically stole their topic. And now they try to find their way in opposition, how to deal with it, to be constructive, because the SPD is aiming for something that they basically support. But now they find ways to, I think, to do party politics and to torpedo the project. Although I have to say they have one fair point, and maybe that's my last point here, but so with the 100 billion Sondervermögen, the special fund, there is a problem because as it stands now, it is not an add-on to us spending 2%, but it's basically a fund that will be used successively over the next few years to ensure that Germany can reach the NATO 2% target, whereas we freeze our ordinary defense budget. And that's what the CDU criticizes heavily, and I think they have every right to do so because it's not a sustainable solution. It means that once this money is used up, we will be left with the status quo ante, which is, I think, not a very good solution.
Yeah, I agree. I think the point that Jana made about the CDU now being in opposition is key. I think they're in some ways quite confused because they're not really sure how to handle this. On the one hand, like Jana said, they want to be constructive, but for a long time they hadn't really decided what that would mean. So sometimes they were pushing the government to take a harder line and to act more quickly and so forth. But then other times they were also like, well, okay, but maybe they're too far also, right? So I think oftentimes it might have been quite difficult for voters to really differentiate between what the CDU would want right now and what the Social Democrats would want right now. And I think that in turn then made it easier for the Social Democrats to deal with that pressure. And then, of course, like I mentioned before, this Russia problem in German politics is not exclusive to Social Democrats, right? So in the CDU, you also have a bunch of people that have a very rosy view of Moscow, and some of them, including people in power, still haven't really changed their opinion. And I think for the Social Democrats, from the outside, I almost had the impression that Scholz's speech was so strong that it almost stunned, his own party. Because at that moment in time, the rocket started flying. Then you have the speech. It was very difficult to really mobilize against it. But like Jana said, the key is going to be what happens. What happens next. When people either get used to the conflict or the intensity of the conflict is reduced. Are you going to see more and more Social Democrats that are opposed to Scholz's, I guess the vision that he outlined back then, at least? Are they going to come out, are they going to come out from hiding, essentially, and mobilize against it? And I think there's a realistic possibility that could happen. But I don't know what share of the party those voices really represent. Because I do get the impression that a lot of leading Social Democrats have genuinely changed their views on all this. I don't know what your impression is, Jana.
I think especially the party leadership, for example, everything that Lars Klingbeil says. But for example, the party group chair, Rolf Mützenich, he is, he has built his entire, I think, worldview on the assumption that one can find, that one could create a European security order, an inclusive European security order with Russia. And his worldview now is in shatters. But I'm not sure how sustainable that is, actually. So I think listening to interviews that he gave recently after the war started, I'm not so sure how much the old status quo ante is considered a thing of the past, or how much, remains from this connection.
Yeah, so zooming in on this status quo ante, so there's this, the speech, the Zeitenwende, the need to invest in the military. So I want to explore with both of you a little bit about why that was necessary in the first place. There's this anecdote that is commonly heard in DC when people once, or at least before the war, when people wanted to complain about Germany, not spending enough on its defense. There was this NATO exercise, and the Germans came in and didn't even have machine guns. They had to use broomsticks. And I would say, I would have said it if I had a nickel for every time I heard that, I'd be rich, but I probably would have maybe $50 by now. I've heard it quite a few times. So what about kind of the state of the military before all this started? Was it in good shape, bad shape? But I also want to touch on what in the status quo ante conception of the military, what was the Bundeswehr for? The U.S. military is there to project power and be anywhere in the world within 24 hours and ensure the stability of trade, XYZ. Why was there a German military? And what shape was it in? And Marcel, we can start with you there.
Yeah, I mean, the sort of what is the military good for? I think that has been, I don't know about Jana, but a lot of people over the years have asked me exactly that, but they didn't mean it in the sense of, what capabilities exactly do we need, but more why do we even have a military in the first place? So I think in terms of public debate, that was often the level that had happened yet. Because Germany has such a hard time debating interests and, trying to come up with ways that it can use its tools to achieve those interests. At least the public debate around this has been quite unclear and honestly not all that serious for quite a long time. In terms of the actual military capabilities, I'm not an expert on defense funding, but as far as I understand, there's just a huge gap in investment in the military. So it's not really that Germany doesn't spend much money on the military. It does, but they spend a lot of money on things that are not necessarily on tanks or ships or submarines or whatever. But stuff like personnel, for example, sucks up a lot of money. And even though Germany spends a lot of money, the funding needs would be even greater. And you have a lot of money that is just being wasted, right? So you see a lot of, like one of the sort of common debates in Europe is about duplication, right? So I don't know, I forgot that statistic, maybe Jana remember, but something about those like 28 battle tanks or something that like the Europeans have, and then the Americans have like one, that sort of stuff. So I guess the big picture is that Germany does spend a lot, but it should really have to spend more, and it has to spend it in a different way to actually spend it effectively. And then, of course, the last couple of decades, the focus in a way really hasn't been Russia, right? I mean, of course, Germans often talk about, defending the alliance and both, but when it came to actual deployments abroad, yeah, some of it was, the sort of tripwire in Eastern Europe, but a lot of the focus was on anti-terrorism. And obviously, when you look at those anti-terrorism missions, in Africa, for example, you're going to need stuff that is very different to the kinds of things that you need to deter Russia effectively.
Jana, over to you there. What's your read on?
No, I can subscribe to everything that Marcel has just said. Maybe just a few footnotes that can be added. I think the problem started basically in the 90s when in Germany, many people, including back then Chancellor Helmut Kohl, believed that Germany is now surrounded by friends only. And the idea was that there was some sort of peace dividend, and that was when we cut military spending dramatically. Because, as I said, I think a few minutes ago, in Germany, the assessment was really kind of, we are done with this. We are done with wars. We are now entering kind of a post-war history. Postmodern. It enters postmodern history, something like that. And so, dividend, we cut defense spending, and then also with the financial crisis in 2007-8 and the following years, there were even more cuts, and the cuts all over Europe were not made in a kind of in a coordinated manner, but every country made its own cuts, and so we ended up with 27 bonsai armies. The problem for Germany was that at a certain point, to not be kind of 100% ready was accepted, and it was, I think, former Defense Minister de Maizière who coined a phrase which I don't know how to translate into English, but basically it's the idea that with 80% operational readiness, one could live, and then when you have a mission, you just concentrate on that and get the equipment from all over the country, basically. And we started to get used to this. And this changed only after 2014, the annexation of Crimea. And the years that followed, we kind of decided that this was not sustainable. And the decision was taken to spend more on defense again over years. And Germany is now spending a lot more than 2014. But the problem is not only the money. I mean, the money was a problem and continues to be one, but it's also, as Marcel said, the it's basically also this connection between industry, the defense industry, the armed forces, the MOD, that wasn't a very healthy relationship. So procurement decisions were taken, and then the projects were delayed. They were more cost intensive. What was delivered was not what was promised. So also there, and also I think an overall lack of political clarity and guidance. And that brings me to your second point, the German army force. I think that was precisely the problem, that many people, also politicians in Berlin, could not really agree on what we need the armed forces for. Of course, we had official documents, like, for example, the actually not so bad White Book in 2016, where we defined interests and tasks, but it was never really a priority in Berlin. So, and from the top, I mean, former Chancellor Angela Merkel was really not interested in this topic at all. She avoided it at all costs. She did not get personally involved. And so, there was a lack of political guidance. And when we did participate in military missions, like, for example, in Mali or in Afghanistan, the story at home was always, we do this to be good allies. We do this basically to show our solidarity with the United States after 9/11, or we do this because we cannot kind of let the French go to Africa alone. But it was never about us. And of course, clearly defined, and politicians also shied away from doing this. So that was the problem. And I think that is still, for me, actually, this is the biggest challenge when it comes to the Zeitenwende and the future ahead of us. It's really, can Germany now define its new strategic culture? Because I think there is a huge mistrust when it comes to also the missions that we participated in. So thinking about Afghanistan and how it ended, I think there is really zero appetite to engage in another mission that we completely focused on territorial defense and NATO and Ukraine. But with Mali, actually, we should debate this these days, because the two mandates are under reconsideration and need to get approval in parliament. So for me, it's really tight. And then the long-term challenge is to define what kind of security and defense actor Germany wants to be in the world, what role it wants to play. And it cannot be about becoming another France or another United Kingdom. It needs to be something that Germany identifies with.
Yeah, I think that's a great point that you just made about, just trying to be a good ally. I think that's totally true. And in a way, I think we still don't talk enough about interest. Even now, when German politicians or public figures in general justify Germany providing military aid to Ukraine, it is almost always, at least that's my impression, Jana, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's almost always in moral terms, right?
Yeah.
It's, the Ukrainians are suffering, and therefore we should help them. And of course, that's true, the Ukrainians are suffering. And I would argue that there's a moral argument to be made that we should help them, also because of our, history in the region and so forth. But the bigger argument is that it's in our very own national interest to ensure that Ukraine doesn't lose. And if we can contribute to that, then we should do it, right? And something that I wonder about, that I worry about going forward, is that if you always lead with the moral argument, then I believe that support could be more fickle, right? You see that also like in German debate, when like the Ukrainian ambassador to Berlin, says something that people don't like, then people go, oh, well, he's not sufficiently grateful. Maybe we should, stop sending them weapons. And of course, that sort of argument totally misses the point, because it's not about charity, and it's, not primarily about, being nice or whatever to the Ukrainians, but it's about our very own interest. And if we don't get that into people's brains, they might change their mind. But at the same time, and I recognize that this is quite difficult, because the German electorate is probably not very receptive of these, interest-based arguments. You probably have to lead with a moral argument to mobilize electoral support in the short term to do the right thing, I guess. So, I can see that it's difficult to balance for the people that are actually in charge and that actually have to make decisions.
Makes sense. So I want to end with one final question. Now, the initial plan for this question was, how is Germany to position itself in Europe going forward? I think that's a big question, maybe hard to predict based on all the complicated factors we have just discussed at length. But I do want to ask, like, if this Zeitenwende is going to stick, if we're going to see, a new consensus emerging, I want to borrow one of kind of the toolkit or the tools from the political risk toolkit, and that's thinking about signposts. What are you looking for as signals that Zeitenwende is sticking or Zeitenwende is not sticking? Are there decisions you're waiting for? Are there speeches? Are there rhetoric? Is it concrete policy steps you're going to be on the lookout for in the coming couple weeks, in the coming months?
I can give you my top three. So first, I think thing to watch is what happens to the Sondervermögen, to the special fund, because this is now, as I said, a heated debate, because the ambition is to anchor it in our basic law. And the CDU insists that a sustainable solution is to be found to make the 2% spending commitment, kind of a long-term commitment, and not only a thing that we will be able to reach in the next 4 years. And whether a solution is found that allows us to use the Sondervermögen for long-term procurement and not long-term procurement decisions, and not that doesn't put us in a position where we need to spend, 25 billion euros a year, which is super difficult to digest and to swallow. Number two would be how we adjust our relationship with China, because I think for me, one of the big lessons learned from our dependency on Russia is what does this tell us about our macroeconomic interdependencies with China, because they also have security risks, and those have not been recognized in Germany. And the third would be how does Germany engage itself in NATO, because I think the aim should really be to make Germany the conventional backbone of NATO. I think Germany must play a leading role in further strengthening of NATO, strengthening the credibility of NATO and alliance cohesion. And yeah, if Germany is doing more on that front, these three things for me are crucial.
And Marcel, what are you looking at?
Yeah, the question that I've been asking myself over the last couple of months is, to what extent are the changes that are happening really happening because there's been a change in Berlin, and to what extent are they just happening as a result of Allied pressure, right? And it's probably no coincidence that a lot of the things that Germany has done over the last couple of months are things that its allies would have very much wanted it to do. So I think everything that Jana said is correct, and I'm also looking out for all of those. One thing that I'm also looking out for, though, is that, like, at one point, is Germany's foreign policy going to move beyond being purely reactive? Like, is there any point at which we will do something because we think it's in our interest to do it, and we don't need to be pushed to do it, for weeks or months or whatever, but we just do it because it's the right thing to do for us. And so far, I'm not super convinced. So that's what I'm on the lookout for.
And on that optimistic note, wanted to thank both of you sincerely for joining today. I said at the very beginning of this that my goal with this whole series is to learn, and I have learned a lot through my discussion with you. So I'm very grateful. To wrap it up, I'm going to give the floor back to FPRI, to Natalia, who's hosting, and I believe she has some closing remarks.
Thanks, Aaron, and thanks again to our guests, Jana and Marcel, for this thought-provoking conversation, and to all of our listeners for participating. As a reminder, if you missed any part of the discussion, the recording will be available shortly. And to explore more from FPRI's research, podcasts, and upcoming events, be sure to visit us on www.fpri.org. Thanks, and until next time.